nobody in the public domain this afternoon, and we have no public speakers. But could you all, as members of the committee, please stay behind? I know Councillor Davis has to leave, but could the rest of you stay behind for 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the meeting? Right, thank you. Obviously, you all know not to have your mobile phones on, and I think that's about all the announcements I need to make. So welcome to the planning on 2nd of July. Apologies for absence, please.
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillors Murphy and Howard.
Right, thank you very much, Richard. I myself and Councillor Ruth Edwards chair the Planning Committee, and to my right,
Councillor Clark, the Vice Chairman.
Joanne Chase, Head of Commercial Law and Solicitor to the committee today.
Thank you, Joanne.
Philip Thomas, Development Services Manager.
Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Craig O'Connor, Development Management Area Manager.
Andrew Jones, Development Management Area Manager.
Louise Corbett, Housing Strategy.
Completed all the introductions. Obviously, we've got no public, but you don't know who is viewing us because we are live streaming. Declarations of interest, please. Nobody has as yet highlighted any. Right, thank you very much. We'll now go on to confirm the accuracy of the minutes of the last meeting. They are listed as page 1 to 12. Unless there are any things raised by any members, I'll take them as read. Could I have somebody to propose? Councillor Evans has proposed, seconded by Councillor Davis. Could I have a show of hands for approval for the minutes? Right, that's all well and done and good, and I will sign them at the end of the meeting. The next on the agenda, I believe, Phil, you're presenting the first one. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Chair.
This is application 01984 on pages 13 to 24.
Thank you. This application was considered at the meeting of committee held on the 28th of May, where members agreed to the applicant's request to defer the application to enable the issue of financial viability to be considered, having regard to the standard policy approach to request a financial contribution towards the provision of affordable housing in the area. To recap briefly, full planning permission is sought for the development of 2 dwellings on land adjacent to 58-7 Crescent, Chepstow, which is that property there. I'll just run through the photographs and talk while we're looking at those. The plan submitted indicate a pair of semi-detached dwellings on that land there beyond the garage in that photograph. That's the area. It's currently in use as a side garden to number 58, and it slopes up from the road towards the woods at the back. And there are some various sheds and outbuildings and a carport on the land. That's looking back towards number 58. The carport's part of the site, so that would come out. And it's all the way along the end of 7 Crescent. Members visited it prior to the meeting on the 28th of May. That's the carport looking back. And so there's a big backdrop and a bank behind with trees, so the site is quite self-contained. It's part of a larger area of amenity importance. Then the next shot is properties opposite, which are set slightly lower down on the other side of the lane. And then that's directly opposite the site. There's some parcel of grassy land. Actually, it's owned by the applicant as well. So that's the site topographical survey and OS plan showing it in context at the end of 7 Crescent. And that's showing the block plan there with 2 dwellings, 4-bedroom dwellings sitting alongside with 3 parking spaces in front of each dwelling. And then that shows a sort of street scene view with the end property there, number 58 to the right, and the 2 dwellings gable on alongside them, and parking below as well in the form of a garage. Those are the plans there showing garage and various accommodation at the bottom on the bottom floor, including utility and hall and loo. Then living accommodation on the first floor with kitchen, dining area and lounge on the first floor, open plan. And then 4 bedrooms with bathroom and ensuite on the upper floor. And those are the elevations there. So because it's split level, it'll read as 2-storey at the rear and 3-storey at the front. So in terms of external finishes, the dwellings will be finished with facing brickwork at the ground and first floor level, with dark grey coloured cedral cladding above, as you can see on the elevational drawings there, with artificial slate or concrete interlocking roof tiles and UPVC framed windows and doors. The issues of access, parking and impact on local amenity are discussed in the report, and officers are satisfied that the proposal can be accommodated on site with harm to highway safety, the visual qualities of the area or the residential amenity of nearby residents. As regards the matter of the Section 106 financial contribution, members have been sent or emailed a copy of the viability assessment that officers have considered within this report. The assessment concludes that the scheme does not stack up financially and can only make a small profit without the £61,000 affordable housing contribution. So officers have considered the assessment against standardised viability modelling and concur with this conclusion and would therefore recommend approval of the application without such a contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe this comes under Chepstow, so the ward member obviously isn't here, so Chepstow member wish to comment first of all, please. Councillor Dovey?
I think geographically
It's closer. Is it closer to you, Councillor Brown?
On the site visit, so it would be better if I didn't comment because I missed the last meeting.
Right, thank you. Councillor Dovey then, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. But simply put, I've found nothing objectionable in this in this application. It will improve the particular area that it's in, and I'm quite happy to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Dovey. Anybody else wish to comment? A good many of the committee were there at the site visit. Councillor Harris, do you wish to comment, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Only to say it's sad that an applicant building 2 large houses like this is only going to make a profit of £5,000. I find it a bit hard to swallow. But the district valuer said, or the valuation has come back, and that is the case. So I don't know why builders bother, but there we are. Well, it's good to know that we'll be addressing this problem later on in the meeting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dovey, your microphone, please. Thank you very much. Anybody else wish to comment now? Do you wish to move then, Councillor Dovey?
Yes, I move acceptance, Madam Chair.
Do you have a seconder? Councillor Matt Feakin has seconded. Could I have a show of hands for approval, please? Right, thank you. With one abstention from Councillor Brown.
Yeah,
Councillor Brown?
because I didn't go on the site visit.
We now go to application 00508, and this is Pandy Abergavenny. Yours, is it, Andrew? Right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So this is a full application for the change of use of an existing annex to a 2-bed holiday let. The annex has been recently converted from a threshing barn under permitted development rights with no physical works. And this is permission to change the use only of the building to holiday use. The existing vehicle access would serve both the annex and the dwelling in continuation. It's also worth noting that the application is only presented to members as the applicant is employed by Monmouthshire County Council. So just turning to the slides, for the benefit of the members that weren't there yesterday, that's, I'm not sure you can see the labels. That's the main dwelling that will be retained with the sort of green-blue powder-coated windows, and it's the annex as it stands on at the moment at the far side with the grey powder-coated windows. There's a storage building there, and below doesn't add much more to that. Phil, if you can just move through. So there we are. So that's, if you can see on the top photograph, there's a small little door there on the ground floor. That's, thanks Phil. So that would serve as the main sort of access to the holiday let. That's a sort of, would effectively function as almost like a shared utility space. And then there's just an internal photograph there showing up. It's a high-level first-floor accommodation, so that shows that the works that have already been carried out to facilitate the use as an annex. That's just a shot there looking out, well, back onto the main road, or the road at the kitchen area, and then there's a view there looking out to the south from one of the bedrooms. Again, that's looking back where members that were there yesterday were stood, and then looking back at the building there. So it's just that, the stone element with the grey powder-coated windows is the subject of the change of use. Any more photos? So, and that's the view then from Pen Bidwell Lane. So, as I say, the site is located off the lane, and is, you can see there on the plan, so that's the extent of the applicant's ownership in blue, and it's just this building on the end. So, with regard to our detailed consideration, the annex would be too small for a self-contained dwelling under policy H4, but there is policy support under criterion C of policy T2, which is visitor accommodation outside settlements, which would allow for conversion of smaller buildings for holiday use. With regards to visual impact, the annex has been already sensibly converted under permitted development rights, and as the change of use requires no external alterations, it's considered there will be no visual impact on either the traditional building or the wider rural landscape. The nearest dwelling is Little Pen Bidwell, which is about 9 metres away from the site to the east, but this is orientated at a fairly oblique angle, and although close, the change of use wouldn't involve any new window openings, and it's considered, therefore, that the change of use would have minimal impact on neighbour amenity. Other neighbouring properties are in excess of 40 metres from the site. Finally, with regards to highway safety, no objection has been received from the Council's highways team. The site would continue to use the same single point of access and provides sufficient off-street parking and turning provisions. So therefore, subject to conditions in the officer's report, which include holiday occupancy restrictions, the application is presented to members to approve.
Thank you, Andrew. I believe Councillor Powell, you're the nearest to this application, are you?
I'm
or
not
Councillor
sure if I'm nearest or Roger, but I am very familiar with the area.
Right, thank you, Councillor Powell. I'll leave you to comment first.
Yeah, I can't see it's going to affect anybody else. It's much the same as if they were living in there. I mean, I would think that the size of it's only going to be one extra car, and there's plenty of room, as we saw ourselves, for turning round and off there. So I propose it's approved.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. Councillor Harris?
Second that, Madam Chair.
Thank you. It's been proposed and seconded, but are there any other comments, first of all, from the committee? None whatsoever? Councillor Plough.
As mentioned at the pre-meeting, the door underneath this extension could really do with upgrading to suit the property. It looks a little tacky at the moment.
I think actually it's a work in process, progress, so it will, I dare say, be done. Right, thank you. Could I have a show of hands for approval then, please?
Unanimous, Chair.
Right, thank you. Indeed, we go now to the next one. Application at Earlswood was withdrawn at the moment, so that, I dare say, will come back again. And we now go to 00745, and this is the Rose Hall in Monmouth on pages 39 to 44. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, this application is at Rolls Hall in Whitecross Street in Monmouth. It is a Grade 2 listed building. It accommodates Monmouth's community hub at the present time. So the library, education, community services are in this location. This application proposes a change of use for 3 areas, 2 offices and also an area within the main library. If you'd like to go to the floor plans, please, Phil. That's rules. That's existing, and then the proposed plan. So as you can see on this plan, there's 3 areas, 2 offices, which would be converted to A2 use. This would be rented out to startup businesses to rent out and to meet customers and potentially have flexible use. It could be financial advisors, it could be insurance companies, it could be people just renting out for, who are agile working, open to the public. And then there's a proposed market area, which would start up crafts, businesses, so retail uses, so startup businesses, so to support new businesses in the area to develop, before they go onto a retail unit. The community hub is open between 8:45 to 7, Monday to Friday, and 9 till 3 on a Saturday. And there's no objections to the planning application through consultation. Monmouth Town Council have come back and recommended approval of the scheme. And as outlined in the report, the proposed development is considered to be acceptable. Therefore, we are recommending approval subject to the conditions.
Right, thank you very much, Craig. Councillor Feakin, I believe you're a member of the Town Council, so you're a Monmouth member to give comment first of all, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a good scheme. I think we should support it, so I'd move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Anybody else now wish to comment? Councillor Alan Davis.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. What a fantastic facility that is, and it's very good to see it being used by the community and fully used by what we saw yesterday. So I would second Councillor Feakin's proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Councillor Dovey.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I too support the scheme. The only comment I would make is this is a building that when you get inside, it is more beautiful and tasteful inside than it is outside. I would like to think that any of the developments that go on inside the building are of such a nature that they don't detract from the building inside and the pleasure people have of going in and looking at it. It would be a terrible shame if it was, well, just filled up willy-nilly, if you get what I mean. It should be developed inside to the same standards that has been put into it to get it into the condition it's in at the moment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dovey. Councillor Jim Higginson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. 68.2, no physical alteration to the fabric of the listed building is proposed, as both internal and external. Therefore, the character and appearance of this part of the Monmouth Conservation Area and the building itself, which is Grade 2 listed, will be preserved, so there's not a problem there.
Yes, I've got fond memories of the Rose Hall in Monmouth. They even had lessons in there when it was in the old secondary school in Monmouth. So it has been well looked after, and it is quite an asset to the town, really. So I'm glad that it's has more potential than what it has, had in the past, which is very good. And I'm sure people who go in there will respect the building, which is wonderful. Councillor Dovey.
Just to say, I wasn't suggesting for a moment that it hasn't been, but I think it is always worthwhile making the point when the opportunity arises to ensure that it is kept as it should be kept.
Thank you. So I believe Councillor Feakin, you moved approval, and you had a seconder from Councillor Davis. So could I have a show of hands for approval, please? That again is unanimous. Thank you all very much. The next item on the agenda, I believe, is with you, Mark. Is Amy coming to give her report, or when does Amy wish to come to the committee? Now or later? We have finished the applications that we had today. Amy isn't quite in front of us now. We shall do the appeals, and you've all got a note on this for your information. Is there anything you'd like to comment on, please, then, Mark?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, this was an interesting one. If you remember, this was one that came to committee fairly recently, and it was actually a member decision, so it's contrary to the officer decision. But the inspector clearly agreed with members. This was a proposal for, if I look through the slides, for a site in the Close Port Skewett, and there was two dwellings, a pair of semi-detached being put in the garden of one of the properties, and narrowing and reducing the size of the gardens of the existing property. And the inspector agreed, saying it would be overdevelopment, out of character with the prevailing character of the area, including the the host dwelling and its neighbours to the right there, and also importantly there was an issue that they hadn't agreed to a planning obligation to secure affordable housing off-site contributions. That was more an issue of principle really than the actual practicalities of that. They haven't put it in, so it wasn't policy compliant, so it was also dismissed on that particular ground. But the key lesson to learn that was unacceptable from a visual point of view.
Thank you for that
So well done,
explanation.
members.
Yeah, thank you. Next one. Who's going to comment on that one?
This is Troy.
Troy?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll pass over to Craig and Amy for a bit more detailed analysis. But yes, is the appeal decision, or the call-in decision for Troy House. So as members recall, we had an application in for conversion of this Grade 2 style listed building into residential accommodation apartments with some enabling new build development in wings, one each side, one replacing some existing kind of 60s and 70s building. So members recall we had a really detailed discussion over a couple of meetings about this one, looking at the benefits of restoring and saving this listed building, which is on our at-risk register, versus some policy constraints. The primary one of those being that it's in undefended floodplain, albeit that the properties themselves wouldn't flood to an unacceptable degree, and also being development in the countryside, but clearly the listed building is where it is. So I'll pass to Amy and Craig for detail, but suffice it to say, the inspector recommended the application be rejected, and the Minister or Cabinet Secretary went along with that decision or agreed with it. So we are very disappointed. We're still considering if there's any further action we take, so I won't say anything now while we're being broadcast. But yeah, we are very disappointed at the approach the Welsh Government and the Inspector have taken to it. But I'll pass over to Amy and Craig to add any detail.
Just to echo what Mark has said, really, as a development management team, myself and Amy, who attended the hearing, we're very frustrated with the decision, and have now got significant concerns about how we move forward with this building, given it is a heritage asset of Monmouth. In terms of the report, as you've no doubt read it by now, it's quite clear in terms of Welsh Government's view on TAM 15 and development within C2 flood zone. The report quite clearly says that if it's in that zone, then we shouldn't be considering any form of highly vulnerable forms of development. And within the report as well, and one of the key arguments that we put forward was that the previous use for this site was a school. Now that does have the same highly vulnerable use as residential, so we thought there was a fallback position. But within the report, the inspector in paragraph 98 actually states that although she recognises that there was highly vulnerable use there, the development still has to be looked at in terms of the intensification and modern policies. Obviously, that's the conclusion that was made by the inspector. However, I felt that planning committee and officers here made a good judgment and made a balanced judgment in terms of the existing use. In terms of the inspector and the viability of the scheme, as I said, I've now got significant concerns about how this site is going to be used in the future. The viability of bringing it forward for a less vulnerable form of development for commercial use is extremely tight. And that is recognised in paragraph 102. The inspector does see the challenge ahead of us in terms of being able to find a use for that site going forward now. However, she felt that the flooding implications and the new build development outweighs those concerns. Also, in terms of enabling development, the inspector did conclude that the new build development element of the scheme didn't meet the test of enabling development given the floodplains confliction. So that's also a concern for us going forward on what development we do there in the future. In terms of our arguments put forward, we felt that when looking at listed buildings and looking at heritage assets, the primary consideration for any development affecting listed buildings is to save it and preserve it for future generations. So we do really feel that we did give a balanced argument forward. However, as you can see in the report, there is a strong inclination that going forward, flooding is a primary consideration. It seems to be the conclusion that it's outweighing the impact on the heritage asset in this particular case. And obviously, in terms of climate change, that might be the way that we need to look at applications in the future. Another point that the inspector did pick up on was the impact the development would have on the historic guarding and the archaeology at the site. Obviously, we did come to a different conclusion on that matter, but we do recognise that there might be a need in the future to consider archaeology evaluation prior to determination. That might be something that we need to look at in terms of lessons learned from this application. But I think as a development management team, we are frustrated with the decision. We're concerned now about how we deal with this site going forward. And there are significant challenges in terms of the viability of this site and bringing it back to stop the deteriorating and bring it back to a beneficial use. So I think that's my main conclusions of the site. Amy, I'm not sure if you want to talk about in terms of how we move forward with it. I know this is a massive challenge, but in terms of the urgent works notice.
Yeah, obviously when we reported back to you in committee quite a while ago now, you gave approval for the urgent works notice. It's a slightly complicated situation now because we don't have a viable use for the building moving forward, but we are still really concerned about the condition of the building, and it isn't something that we want to just let lie given this condition. So we have been making effort and working with the owner and the agent in trying to draw up a schedule of work to try and address some of these concerns. So it isn't something that we've forgotten about, but it is a slightly more complicated situation given the recent decision. So pending the outcome of any challenge that or conversations that we do have moving forward, we really need to consider how we're going to deal with this building. But it isn't a great situation right now.
Chair, one last comment from me, if I may. A couple of other points in terms of the actual call-in and things reflected in the inspector's report were from the Welsh Government Decisions Branch letter, which said that they didn't feel it was clear why we were going against policy and why committee went with that decision. I personally don't accept that argument. I think both our reports that came to committee and the meetings, which are webcast, are very clear why the decision was what it was. There perhaps wasn't huge detail in the minutes and discussion because you were agreeing with the officer recommendation. If it being against recommendation would have had that extra detail in the minutes, but there wasn't that need for it. So I don't particularly accept that criticism, to be fair. Hopefully you know us well enough to know that we will take stuff on the chin if we conclude that we were in the wrong, or appeal decisions, are to be learnt from, but this isn't one that we're happy about. It wouldn't affect it being called in. I think the reason the need to call it in for the Welsh Government was clear. It is a really challenging policy area of how you make that weighing up. But yeah, some of the reasons given I thought were rather erroneous as well.
Thank you for that comment, and thank you, Amy and Craig also. Anybody else wish to comment on this decision? Councillor Harrison, Councillor Power, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We all know how we felt about this when it came to the planning committee, and I think we all feel devastated at the outcome. I think this is such a fantastic building in such a fantastic site that we should not take this lying down, and I think we should, as a committee, write to the First Minister and with our comments and invite him to come with us as the planning committee to go and have a look at what his officers have turned down. He hasn't seen it, I'm sure he hasn't seen it. As we know, and it's been mentioned, he is capable of overturning his officers' decisions, and he's done it already, so that's what I'd recommend.
Thank you for those comments, Roger. Yes, it's not just an old building in the countryside. It's got a wealth of history and everything attached to it that would be lost for future generations to understand what happened in the area. And I think, exactly, very, very important. Councillor Powell and Councillor Brown.
I understand that it was only viable to the developer to do if he built the new piece. Is there any, would they have accepted it if they new piece hadn't been there, would they accept it if you're just organising the main building? I know that it probably isn't viable to do it from the builder's point of view, but if they'd accept that, and that would be all right, why would the flooding make any difference? Because the school was there, and you remember far better than me about these things, and surely it hasn't flooded any worse since those days, and there must have been a lot of coming and going in those days, and nobody stopped them. Nobody said it was in a floodplain and they couldn't use it as a school. So there's sort of two ideas of going down the road, but whether they'd listen, I don't know. But is it at all possible that it could be renovated without the new building, or is that too expensive?
I think Councillor Powell, Amy would comment on that, and I think, yes, when you read the report, it feels like that when you read it. Amy?
The new build was considered necessary or viable for a residential use. But if we were looking at a different use for the building, for example, like a hotel, then you wouldn't necessarily need the enabling development in that form, and it wouldn't need to be that big. However, the decision is that no form of highly vulnerable development is appropriate for that building in that location, which also excludes a hotel, which would have been viable. And in terms of the flooding, it's not recorded that Troy House has flooded. However, that is what the data is telling us, that it will flood. And unfortunately, the decision has been made that is because it is in a C2 highly vulnerable zone, then those uses are not considered appropriate, regardless of the mitigation that was put forward.
Thank you, Amy. Councillor Brown?
Yes, thank you. I just wondered whether or not a suggested compromise could be put forward, because when it came to committee, I was mainly concerned about the lower level flats because of the fact that they are more vulnerable to being flooded. And I did suggest different uses for the lower floor, you know, because if you have luxury flats, you can have sort of lounges at the bottom and, you know, sort of a library and a shared kitchen and various other things, or, you know, a gym or something like that. Or even underneath, it redesigned so that you had parking underneath, because my concern was mainly having residential in basically, you know, because you are on the bottom floor, and there are ways around that in terms of the design of the scheme, and I would have thought that that would have been a better compromise to have dealt with the flood C2 level, and I did suggest it at committee, but you know, it wasn't looked at. But it might be something that could be thought of as a redesign of the scheme. You know, even if the new builds had garages and parking underneath, that it because nobody's so bothered about, you know, a car being flooded, but if where you're living is flooded, then, you know, that is a concern. And when you look at the old use before it was a school, but I suspect that the living accommodation, if it was a boarding school, was for the higher floors, and that possibly the bottom floor could have been used for things like offices and classrooms. In other words, not directly where people were actually sleeping. So I just wondered whether that could be an idea, to say that you've listened, and wonder whether the Minister could consider a redesign that would take account of the lower floor flood C2 concerns.
Okay, Councillor Brown. Amy, do you wish to comment?
Yeah, I would clarify that. The ground floor in the house, we actually raised it by 200 mil, so it would be flood free. So the ground floor of the house would not flood, and the new build was also outside of the flood level. So all of the living accommodation on all floors was flood free, even in the proposals that were put forward. So it was only the car park that would flood. And that is the problem that the Minister still had, that the egress and ingress to the site and the car park would flood. And it is the principle of it being within a C2 was the problem. I think the wording at the beginning of the inspector's report where it says the consideration of the application should end here, principally because it is in a C2 zone, the mitigation was irrelevant, unfortunately.
Thank you, Amy. Councillor Dovey? Yes, sorry.
I was just thinking, I mean, if it was the car park zone that they didn't like, you know, if you had parking underneath, then surely you'd be avoiding that zone anyway.
Craig?
In terms of TAM 15, it says there's no highly vulnerable form of development in C2. That doesn't matter if it's on the first floor, second floor, third floor. It's just a blanket no in terms of having that type of use in that flood area. And some of the reasoning around the car park is because the flood water, given the velocity of the water, can actually drag the cars down and cause more damage and cause more blockage, so it can cause additional flooding. So that's the reason why these type of uses aren't considered to be appropriate in floodplains. And the other issue is if we the reason the policy is there is that if there is a flood, emergency services finds it very difficult to access these sites to save and to rescue people in terms of if that case is to occur. So although we are frustrated with, in terms of this site, in terms of the balance that it has against the heritage asset, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the decision, the final decision, and that's the reason why there is this stance with highly vulnerable forms of development in the floodplain. So, as Amy said, it's the principle which is the Welsh Government has said is unacceptable in this particular case.
I think it's a double whammy for Monmouth, really, because it brings in Hadnock Road almost under the same umbrella on the other side of town. Councillor Dovey, quickly, please.
I know it might sound a damn thing to say, but have we exhausted every alternative use that we could put this to with the limitations that there are on it?
The honest answer is no. I don't think we've exhausted every other option. We haven't done a full feasibility study or an options appraisal, but I think we can make a very educated decision based on the viability assessments that have already been put forward on the previous application and knowing what we know about the market. The extent of the work necessary to bring Troy House back into a good condition is substantial. It's a very, very big place. And we're looking now at the urgent works notice and trying to put some figures up against that. I don't know what they are, so I can't tell you now, but it's going to be quite a lot of money. So we need to think very cleverly about, well, how we're going to use the building and what we're going to do. But those are questions that we need to go back and ask ourselves now. What can we do? How can we move this forward?
Thank you, Amy. Councillor Feakin.
Thank you, Chair. For me, this is an issue which has come back to bite us twice in Monmouth, with Hadnock Road as well. And the issue is around TAN 15. And the issue, in my mind, is about the distinction between development and redevelopment. And I think that there's a very clear distinction in my mind that those two should be separated. However, TAN 15 doesn't allow that position. I think that should be something that should be presented, because redevelopment on an existing property that has extant planning permission, with additions, maybe with exterior wings or whatever, as this would have come forward, is a very different proposal to swathes of new house in a floodplain or in a valley, which I feel is what TAN 15 was aimed at addressing, not redevelopment of existing properties. For a whole host of reasons. Just recently I've been involved in another planning committee where we had a TAN 15 issue right in the middle of a village, which would have prevented any development within the middle of an existing settlement which has never flooded in history. But if there was fault to be laid in anyone's door in that regard, it would have been in the flood risk assessment and the plans and the maps that was being benched against in order to prevent the planning position. But I see that Welsh Government have just prepared a new report with a raft of recommendations, 14 specifically, prepared by JBA that will seek to alter TAN 15 if they're adopted by Welsh Government. Now might be a pertinent time for us to sort of try and lobby that position to say there are existing issues around Monmouthshire, existing issues around existing sites with extant planning permission, that TAN 15 is potentially going to almost be a catastrophic result for us if we don't do something to either alter the plans to make them more respective of the exact locations, or to actually delve in and needle out the position between development and redevelopment. So if there was one thing that I would suggest, it would be go forward to Welsh Government now and look to seek to add some weight to this readoption of the policy.
Thank you. Mark wishes to comment now. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's a timely comment in a sense. I understand that TAN 15 is being revised. It's due to be consulted on this month. So we'll wait to see what that says. Although from an informal discussion with NRW, I'm not optimistic that it's going to be more risk-based, which I think is the approach JBA was taking. Suggesting it should be a more risk-based approach. I don't think it's going to do that. At the moment, what we have, as Craig and Amy mentioned, is very much a precautionary approach. Quite simply avoid the floodplain on undefended sites like this. So I don't think we have any reason to believe the floodplain maps are wrong in this instance. It is a floodplain, it is undefended. It's that policy principle, and the way the Welsh Government's looking at it at the moment is well, pretty much computer says no. It's in C2, it's highly runnable. That's the end of the discussion. Even if you go as far as doing a flood consequence assessment, reassure yourself that the ground floor won't even flood, as Amy said. Still won't even get beyond that point. So, yeah, we'll keep an eye on the new policy, but I'm not holding my breath at the moment.
It does make you wonder when that house was first built in, was it 1700 or something like that, Amy? That I'm sure they didn't have maps and all that, and it would have taken years to, it would have been years to build, for there was a reason why such a huge residence was ever built in that location. So, yes, maybe so. I'm going to draw this to the close now in case there is a really pertinent question or comment somebody wishes to make. Councillor Dovey, then Councillor Brown, and then that is the end of the discussion on Troy House. Thank you.
Well, the difference was they had common sense and local knowledge in the period you were talking about, Madam Chairman. The point is, as Mark said, they're reviewing this particular area at the moment. Is this not a time for us to lobby for change in this area? Presumably, they're not going to. Oh, God, I'm going to dread saying this. Presumably, they're not going to make a decision without taking some input from somebody, or they're going to look at a crystal ball. You know, is there not an opportunity for us to point out the clear anomalies that there are here? Can we not make a presentation to the committee or whatever, who are going to reassess what they're doing and say, will you consider further, or will you consider the situations that we know exist in a number of areas where this needs addressing? Because the situation is almost insoluble.
Thank you, Councillor Dovey. Mark, do you wish to comment?
Yeah, I think same answer as Councillor Feakins. The consultation's coming out. So what I suggest then is when it's arrived, we could have a session after perhaps August committee if the agenda is sensible, and talk through what response we should provide to that consultation with yourselves.
Yeah, I think I'm generally in favour of TAN 15. So obviously I differ from the people here, because I think the concern about residential property flooding is a major concern for householders, and the difficulty of obtaining insurance and so forth. I mean, it might not be a question of the policy. It may just be a question of saying, well, you know, that some discretion with regard to listed historical buildings, as opposed to looking at the policy as a whole. And in terms of if Councillor Feaking's comment in relation to a village that didn't flood, I think I can find pictures from local areas in flooding exactly in that zone. The other issue is that I don't know whether we've looked at all uses, because when I read TAM 15, it does actually say that there's different types of uses where you can actually do a risk flood assessment, which is things like less vulnerable uses like office accommodation and so forth. So I don't know whether we've actually explored all possibilities for this particular site. So, you know, just to say it's residential, I don't think that's not what TAM 15 actually says.
I think I agree with what Councillor Feakin said, where a redevelopment of a building that's already in TAM 15 is very different to say if you want to put a new housing estate on a floodplain. I think that is the crucial difference between what we're looking at and what is TAM 15 is there to safeguard new development. Councillor Harris, and then you're the last one with a question or a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to remind the committee that I suggested maybe we wrote inviting the First Minister to come and have a look at it. I don't know what the committee thinks about that.
Would you all be agreeable to that? I'm sure you would. Right, thank you for that. Now back to you, Mark, and then I think that's the end of the discussion.
Yeah, only very briefly, Chair, just to make it clear, as officers, we support the theory behind TAM 15, the in-principle avoidance of flood risk, avoiding greenfield sites in C1, avoiding C2 for highly vulnerable development. In principle, we just take the view that it is part of a balanced decision when you have really extreme cases like this. So the case we were presenting in this was the listed building with a viable use can be saved and there is no harm to life in the way we were looking at it, or you just stick rigidly to policy. It's that rigidity that we think should be changed. As you said, Chair, the in-principle avoidance of risk, completely support the way he looks at climate change going forwards. Don't argue with that either. But where the modelling says there isn't a problem and there's extreme circumstances, I can't think of a case where this would replicate itself. So I don't think we or even the Welsh Government would get ourselves painted into a corner having set some kind of a precedent with a decision, because it'd be such relatively unique circumstances. But anyway, that's just to clarify our position. We're not saying TAM 15 needs scrapping, just some latitude in rare cases.
Thank you, Mark. That's the end of that discussion on Troy House. We have item 7, which is the list of the appeals that we've received, so I'm sure you can all just note those. And with that, I would like to declare the meeting closed, but Richard will switch off the... Oh, sorry, but we're doing the SPGs now. Sorry for that, we did those in a roundabout way. Anyway, right, over to you then, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If I can pass to Louise in a moment for a bit more detail. But this is to seek Planning Committee's comments on the affordable housing supplementary planning guidance. So as you know, we brought it to you in April. It's now been out to consultation, including Adult Select Committee, and I think 7 or so other groups and members of the public also responded. So it's presented back to you before going to Cabinet, where we're seeking agreement to adopt. If Louise is happy going through the detail, there's a couple of highlights from the consultation, a couple of small changes we are proposing, and some that we're not proposing to make.
Anybody wish to comment? I think we did have it all in our brief anyway. Sorry?
I don't know if you wanted me to go through it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Louise, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, so it was put out to public consultation for a 6-week period. We've had 12 parties comment on the SPG, and there is a summary provided in the attached report pack. There were no major objections, and there's just been a small number of minor amendments considered necessary. One of the main sort of talking points around it was barn conversions, and where there's just going to be one barn to be brought back into use, that we would exempt it from having to pay a commuted sum. There's quite a lot of discussion around that, but we have looked at the evidence base, we have looked at the reasoning behind that decision, and we've decided that actually that is the right thing to do. And when looking at the viability assessments of barn conversions, there just isn't enough leeway, unfortunately, to pay the commuted sum, so we've decided to keep that the same. Other than that, there were some comments around the viability assessments and then being made public and whether or not that was the right thing to do. But again, we've kept that the same. We believe that's absolutely the right thing to do, so that it's transparent. So basically, like I say, there was 12 comments. We've looked at them all, and there are some minor changes. But, you know, we're hoping that we can get your endorsement today to actually go forward then and get it adopted and in place.
Anybody wish to comment? Councillor Brown, then, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm pleased to see that there's in the policy, I think on page 68, there's the idea of it being more, I'm just trying to find it now, the idea of it being more open in terms of the viability assessment. I think I'm just trying to scroll through to the bottom of page 68, if you could just bear with me. Yeah, it says there that it's the information, I think it's on the at the bottom, Roman numeral 8, where it says, where a viability estimate is deemed necessary, the council will require applicants to provide detailed information and supporting evidence. And then it talks about an open book approach required, which I think is a good thing. But one of the concerns that I've got is still in relation to what was raised at the Adults Select Committee, because you know, it said with regard to barns, it was difficult for large barns and to work those out. But it did offer another alternative, which was basically just to keep single barns in. And the reason I'm arguing this is I know that in my ward, a barn was assessed at a contribution of 60,000. And in this committee, we've heard how the development in Chepstow, that was, you know, 62,000. So why is it fair to have a viability assessment on that particular development and not have one on a barn, you see? So I can't understand that, because it says in this point at the bottom of page 68 that where a viability assessment is deemed necessary, the council will require the applicants to provide the detailed information, and then it goes off to the district valuer and the cost will be borne by the developer. So it's at no cost to the council. So the question I've got to ask is, why are we throwing away you know, potential affordable housing contributions, and why is it fair that a development to do with a house effectively has to pay, but the development to do with a single barn doesn't? I can't see that is fair.
Chair, thanks. I can see the point that Councillor Brown's trying to make. What our experience has shown is that the cost of doing a barn conversion is higher than the new build dwelling per square metre. It's significantly higher. Even with bigger barns, we haven't been able to secure those contributions because they've come back as being unviable on the whole. And if you go back to the policy purpose of barn conversions, the purpose is to keep that traditional rural building that's worthy of retention for its character and its aesthetic purposes. So it's something that we want to happen, to keep them at a sensible size, not having big extensions or anything, but ideally trying to keep their form as well. So I think in terms of what we're trying to achieve with the policy and support them happening, my advice is to keep it more simple, go with what the evidence is showing us up until now, and not feel like we're putting extra obstacles in people's way. They could all come in for a DVS check, having paid for it, and it'll come back and conclude what we're saying, but that is an extra hurdle for them to jump through. So that's why we've recommended what we've recommended. But if committee has a clear view, that's what we'll pass on to Cabinet so they can inform their decision.
Anybody else wish to comment? No, so it's agreed then, presumably, that it goes to Cabinet now?
Sorry, Chair, could I vote against it, because
Yes,
I'm
you
concerned
can do.
about the single barns not being included. And I also think that the comments haven't included the fact that Councillor Pratt in the Adults Select was very concerned not only about excluding single barns, but also excluding listed buildings, because of the fact that they are often very expensive. and often worth a lot. And, you know, whether we were actually giving away contributions that should go towards affordable housing. So, I mean, obviously other people might not agree, but I would like to vote against it. Thank you.
Councillor Feakin.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add a counterpoint to that point, I guess, we do need, in my mind, to consider the built heritage that we have around us, and we need to support that. I guess we have a choice whether we let things like listed buildings crumble to the ground and barns crumble to the ground, or whether we support the redevelopment and reuse. And I think, going on Mark's comments, if we look at the historic or the amounts that have been given over for affordable housing from barn conversions, having gone through the viability process, which is an extremely long-winded and expensive process, and would be enough to prevent some people coming forward. If you're spending £20,000 on a viability assessment, that's a significant hurdle to prevent someone coming forward with something, especially for a smaller barn. And so, like I say, to give a counterpoint to Councillor Brown's position, I think that we should go along with the SPG as it's been written, and I think it's a very sound position for us to take. And I think, you know, if we're looking at financial terms, we only have to look back in time to see what barn conversions have delivered to us as an authority versus the officer time that we've spent in order to justify that position. So I think it's a very sound position, so I'd like to put that recommendation forward with the SPG.
Thank you, Councillor Feakin. Do you have a seconder for the recommendation? Councillor Webb. Could I have a show of hands for the recommendation? And those against? Yes, Councillor Brown. Thank you. That concludes the meeting. If Richard could go and switch off the live streaming, please, if you could all be very patient and wait for a couple of minutes for Richard to do that.